A soldier with a rifle on his back, kneeling in a rice paddy, planting seeds. To a conventional Western military mind, that image looks like a contradiction, a breakdown in discipline, a misallocation of trained combat personnel. When details of Burkina Faso's military agricultural strategy began circulating among security analysts and former French military officials, the reaction in some quarters was dismissive, even mocking. Soldiers are not farmers. Combat engineers are not agronomists. A military diverted into agricultural labor, the critics argued, is a military weakened at exactly the moment an insurgency demands its full attention. It was the kind of confident dismissal that comes from applying conventional doctrine to an unconventional war. Months later, the numbers told a different story. Over 4,600 trained agricultural soldiers graduated. 11,000 hectares of strategic farmland cleared, secured, and cultivated. Terrorist blockades of farming communities broken. Food production climbing even as the security situation remained contested. The strategy that was mocked as a contradiction turned out to be exactly the innovation that conventional military doctrine had never considered necessary. This is the story of the rifle and the plow. To understand why Burkina Faso's farmer-soldier strategy represents a genuine military innovation rather than a desperate improvisation, you need to understand the specific weapon that Sahelian insurgent groups have used for years: hunger. Across the Sahel, jihadist and insurgent groups have systematically targeted the agricultural lifeline of rural communities as a deliberate tactic of war, blockading roads that farmers need to reach their fields, destroying irrigation infrastructure, burning standing crops before harvest, preventing seed and fertilizer deliveries from reaching besieged villages, forcing farming populations to abandon productive land and flee toward already strained urban centers. This is not collateral damage from a broader conflict. It is a calculated strategy. A starved, displaced population is a population with fewer resources to resist, fewer young men available for state security forces, and a greater dependency on whatever group controls the flow of food and supplies into a contested region. Conventional counterinsurgency doctrine, the kind taught in French and other Western military academies, treats this primarily as a security problem to be solved with patrols, checkpoints, and kinetic operations against insurgent forces. Secure the area. Then eventually agricultural activity can resume. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government looked at this doctrine and identified its central flaw. Security and food production were being treated as sequential problems. Solve one, then address the other. When in the Sahel, they are in fact the same problem, requiring a simultaneous solution. The response was the VDP agricultural militia model. Civilian defense volunteers operating under what their own commanders describe as a dual mandate: the rifle and the plow. These are not soldiers temporarily reassigned to farm work as an emergency stopgap. They are trained through a rigorous program that deliberately fuses agronomic science with military discipline from the very beginning. The training itself reflects the dual nature of the mission. Recruits learn weapons handling, patrol tactics, and perimeter security alongside irrigation management, crop science, and mechanized farming techniques. As of April 2026, over 4,600 of these agricultural VDPs, including hundreds of women, have completed this training and graduated into active deployment. The operational logic is direct. A VDP unit moves into a contested farming region. It establishes a heavily armed perimeter, denying insurgent groups the ability to blockade or threaten the area. And then critically, the same personnel who just secured that perimeter put down their primary weapons, pick up agricultural tools, and begin working the land themselves, alongside local farmers. This collapses the sequential security then agriculture model into a single integrated operation. There is no gap between when an area becomes secure and when farming can resume, because the same force providing security is simultaneously providing agricultural labor and expertise. Here is why this approach drew skepticism from military traditionalists trained in conventional counterinsurgency theory. Standard military doctrine, including the doctrine that shaped decades of French military engagement across the Sahel, treats specialization as a core principle of effective force structure. Infantry units train for combat. Combat engineers train for construction, demolition, and fortification. Logistics units train for supply chain management. Agricultural expertise, when it factors into military planning at all, typically falls under separate civil affairs units, operating with distinctly different training, equipment, and chain of command from combat forces. Blending combat-capable militia with agricultural labor at scale runs directly against this specialization principle. The traditionalist critique was straightforward. Soldiers trained simultaneously for combat and farming will be less proficient at both than soldiers trained exclusively for one or the other. A jack of two trades, master of neither. This critique carries real weight in conventional warfare between organized military forces, where specialized proficiency in a single combat discipline can be decisive. But the Sahelian conflict is not primarily that kind of war. It is an insurgency fought substantially over control of population, resources, and territory, where the ability to simultaneously secure and sustain a farming community provides strategic value that pure combat specialization cannot replicate. A perfectly trained infantry unit that clears an area and then withdraws, leaving farmers to face the same blockade and intimidation threats once the patrol moves on, achieves only temporary security. A VDP unit that clears an area and then remains, farming alongside the community while maintaining its armed perimeter, converts temporary security into sustained agricultural productivity, denying the insurgency its primary leverage over that population indefinitely, not just during the patrol window. The numbers behind this strategy reveal a mobilization effort of genuine scale, not a symbolic pilot program. When the broader presidential initiative for agriculture rolled out, the government mobilized over 3,000 military personnel, including combat engineers alongside the VDP militia, deployed directly alongside 4,000 internally displaced persons. Together, these combined battalions cleared, plowed, and harvested over 11,000 hectares of strategic agricultural land. 11,000 hectares is not a demonstration project. It represents a substantial agricultural operation requiring sustained logistics, equipment deployment, and security coordination across an extended campaign season. The military's heavy machinery, bulldozers, excavators, and other combat engineering equipment originally intended for fortification and obstacle-clearing operations was redirected to terraform and cultivate land at an industrial scale that civilian farming communities operating with limited mechanization could never have achieved independently. This represents a deliberate redeployment of military engineering capacity toward agricultural infrastructure, treating land terraforming and irrigation preparation as a legitimate combat engineering mission rather than a civilian-only task entirely separate from military operations. Every military base in Burkina Faso now operates under strict executive orders to produce its own food, using military land for crops and livestock, a policy that simultaneously reduces the armed forces' drain on the civilian food budget and reinforces the broader cultural normalization of soldiers engaging directly in agricultural production. The same philosophy of converting institutional capacity into agricultural production extended beyond the military into Burkina Faso's prison system. Traoré personally visited the Baporo Penitentiary Center and refused to let it continue operating as what he described as a colonial-style holding cell. The transformation that followed mirrors the logic of the VDP model in a different institutional context. Inmates are now trained in agricultural techniques, learning to grow and care for crops using modern farming tools and methods. The results are measurable. Baporo inmates have cultivated a 40-hectare cornfield in the middle of a dry, challenging agricultural zone, a substantial production operation generated entirely from a population that, under the previous correctional model, contributed nothing to the nation's food security. This reflects the broader strategic principle running through Traoré's entire mobilization doctrine. Every institution capable of contributing personnel to food production should be doing so, regardless of whether that institution's traditional mandate included agriculture. The military secures and farms. The prison system trains and farms. Universities transfer their agricultural engineers directly into rural cooperatives rather than leaving them in air-conditioned capital offices. Every available human resource becomes part of the national food security apparatus. To understand the specific skepticism this strategy encountered from French and broader Western military circles, you need to understand the historical relationship between French military doctrine and Sahelian counterinsurgency operations. France maintained a substantial military presence across the Sahel for nearly a decade through Operations Serval and Barkhane, deploying conventional counterinsurgency doctrine that emphasized specialized combat operations, intelligence-driven targeting of insurgent leadership, and partnership with host nation military forces trained according to largely French doctrinal frameworks. This doctrine achieved tactical successes against specific insurgent groups and leadership figures, but struggled to produce durable strategic outcomes, a reality widely acknowledged even within French military and policy circles by the time French forces were expelled from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger between 2022 and 2023. When Traoré's government began developing the VDP agricultural militia model as an alternative approach, it represented an implicit critique of the doctrine that French forces had spent nearly a decade applying without achieving lasting stabilization. Military traditionalists steeped in that doctrine viewed the blending of combat and agricultural roles as a retreat from professional military standards, civilian militia performing agricultural labor framed as evidence of an under-resourced, improvised security apparatus rather than a deliberate strategic innovation. This skepticism reflected a genuine doctrinal disagreement, not simple prejudice. Conventional military analysts trained in specialized force structures had legitimate reasons to question whether blended combat agricultural units could maintain adequate combat readiness. But the doctrinal disagreement also reflected something else, a reluctance to acknowledge that a strategy developed independently by a government that had just expelled French forces might represent a more contextually appropriate response to the specific nature of Sahelian insurgency than the doctrine those forces had spent a decade applying. By 2024, Burkina Faso's total cereal production reached 6 million tons, more than sufficient for the entire domestic population, achieved during a period when the security situation across significant portions of the country remained genuinely contested. This outcome directly challenges the core assumption underlying the traditionalist critique, that diverting military and security resources toward agricultural labor would necessarily weaken overall security and food production simultaneously. Instead, the integrated approach appears to have strengthened both. Farming communities operating under VDP protection reported being able to work fields that insurgent blockades had previously rendered unusable. The dual mandate units provided exactly the kind of sustained, embedded security presence that pure patrol-based counterinsurgency struggled to deliver, because the security forces had a direct, ongoing stake in the agricultural productivity of the areas they protected, rather than treating security as a separate objective from economic development. The irrigation perimeters that now produce 6 tons of rice per hectare in places like Banzasson, the wheat fields that grew in defiance of 60 years of expert consensus that wheat could not survive in the Sahel, the rice processing facility now ranked among Africa's top 10. None of this production capacity exists in isolation from the security apparatus that made sustained farming possible in contested regions. The VDP model did not simply coexist with the broader agricultural revolution. In significant respects, it enabled it, by denying insurgent groups their primary leverage tool over rural populations. Among the most significant aspects of the VDP agricultural program, and one that drew particular skepticism from traditionalist military observers, is the substantial participation of women. Hundreds of women are among the over 4,600 graduates who have completed the rigorous training program fusing agronomic science with military discipline. This represents a double departure from conventional expectations. Not only does the program blend combat training with agricultural labor, defying specialized force structure doctrine, but it does so while integrating women into roles that combine armed security responsibilities with technical agricultural expertise, a combination that traditional Sahelian gender roles and conventional military force composition both historically excluded. For critics who viewed the entire VDP model as an improvised departure from professional military standards, the visible participation of women in armed agricultural militia roles often became an additional point of dismissal, treated as further evidence that this was civilian volunteerism rather than serious military doctrine. But the operational results tell a different story. Women VDP graduates have contributed directly to the 11,000 hectares cleared and cultivated under the broader presidential initiative, bringing agricultural expertise that in many Sahelian farming communities, women have traditionally held more directly than men, due to the historical division of agricultural labor. Far from a weakness, integrating that existing agricultural knowledge into the security and production apparatus represented a practical strategic advantage that purely conventional, male-dominated combat force structures would have been unable to access. As the results of Burkina Faso's VDP model became increasingly difficult to dismiss, neighboring Sahelian governments began studying the approach directly. Mali and Niger, the other members of the Alliance of Sahel states, have faced nearly identical security challenges. Insurgent groups using agricultural blockades and food access as instruments of population control across contested rural territories. A security and agriculture model demonstrated to simultaneously deny insurgents their food weaponization strategy while directly contributing to national cereal production carries obvious strategic appeal for governments confronting the same underlying conflict dynamics. If the VDP dual mandate approach spreads across the broader alliance of Sahel states, it would represent a genuine doctrinal innovation originating from within the region itself, developed in direct response to the specific character of Sahelian insurgency, rather than imported from conventional Western counterinsurgency frameworks that had already demonstrated their limitations over the preceding decade of French-led operations. That distinction matters enormously for how the strategy is likely to be received and adapted across the region. A doctrine developed by Sahelian forces, tested under Sahelian conditions, and validated by measurable agricultural and security outcomes carries a legitimacy that an externally imposed framework, however technically sophisticated, has consistently struggled to achieve across the region's recent counterinsurgency history. The image of a soldier kneeling in a rice paddy, rifle slung across the back, planting seeds rather than clearing a sector, was easy to mock from the comfortable distance of conventional military doctrine. It looked like an improvisation, a sign of an under-resourced force stretched too thin to maintain professional standards, a contradiction between the discipline of soldiering and the patience of farming. But conventional doctrine was built to fight conventional wars, and the Sahel has never offered Burkina Faso that kind of war. It offered a conflict where hunger itself became a weapon, where blockading a village's access to its own fields proved as strategically effective as any direct assault, and where 6 decades of imported counterinsurgency frameworks, however professionally executed, never quite managed to convert tactical victories into lasting stability. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government looked at that specific reality and built a specific answer to it. 4,600 trained agricultural soldiers, 11,000 hectares secured and cultivated, a prison-turned cornfield, every military base growing its own food, hundreds of women integrated into a force that defies easy categorization as either purely civilian or purely combat. The rifle and the plow, carried by the same hands, deployed by the same unit, in the same operation. It was mocked as a contradiction. It turned out to be the strategy that conventional doctrine never had a reason to consider, because conventional doctrine was never built by people who had to simultaneously defend a harvest and grow one. 6 million tons of cereal production, a nation that halted all rice imports, farmland secured in regions that blockades once made unusable. The results did not just answer the skepticism. They rewrote the doctrine,